You're listening to Tales of Vatican Secrets, and if you found your way here tonight, there's a reason for that. Before we go further, take a moment and subscribe if you haven't yet. It helps more than you might think. I'm curious, actually. Which country are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? It's late here. The kind of late where the world feels quieter, and maybe that's perfect for what we're about to discuss. Tonight isn't about whispers and shadows. Tonight is about real documents, real decisions, real systems that shaped what the world could and couldn't know about the Vatican's past. There's a specific moment when everything changed, when the rules governing centuries of papal records were rewritten, and once you understand what happened, you'll see the Vatican archives differently. You're past the point of turning back now. Let's begin. You're standing in a moment that doesn't officially exist yet, sometime in the middle months of 1880, and you're watching a problem that the Vatican has been trying to ignore for nearly a decade finally force its way into the open. The problem isn't theological, and it isn't about faith. The problem is physical, bureaucratic, and embarrassingly practical. The Vatican Secret Archives, the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum as it's formally known, has been accumulating papal correspondence, diplomatic letters, trial records, financial ledgers, and administrative documents for centuries. But there's never been a systematic way to organize them, catalog them, or decide who gets to see them. Pope Leo XIII, who took the papal throne in 1878, inherits a collection that fills dozens of rooms in the Vatican Palace, the Apostolic Palace specifically, spread across corridors that most Vatican employees have never entered. Some of these rooms are located in the Tower of the Winds, the Torre dei Venti, a structure built in the late 1500s under Pope Gregory XIII, originally designed as an astronomical observatory, but later repurposed for document storage when the Vatican ran out of space. The Torre dei Venti is not a romantic location. It's a cramped, poorly ventilated stone tower where humidity damages parchment, where dust accumulates on shelves that were never designed to hold the weight of bound registers, and where the lack of any cataloging system means that finding a specific document requires either extraordinary luck or weeks of manual searching. You need to understand something about how these documents were stored. Before 1880, there was no universal catalog. There was no classification code. There was no reference system that a researcher could use to locate a specific letter or decree. Instead, documents were grouped by the papal administration that produced them, stored in wooden chests or on open shelves, labeled inconsistently or not at all. If you wanted to find a letter sent by Pope Innocent XI in 1680, you would need to know which room held the Innocent, the 11th, materials, then search through every box and bundle until you found it. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this disorganization was intentional, a way to make the archives inaccessible without officially closing them, or simply the result of centuries of bureaucratic neglect. What's not disputed is that by 1880, the system is unsustainable. The problem becomes urgent because of a man named Augustin Thiner, a German Catholic priest and historian who served as the prefect of the Vatican Secret Archives from 1855 until 1870. Thiner is one of the first archivists who genuinely believes that historical documents should be available to serious scholars, and during his tenure, he quietly grants access to researchers who previously would have been turned away. He doesn't advertise this. He doesn't announce a policy change. He simply allows certain historians, particularly those working on medieval church history, to enter restricted areas of the archives and examine documents that haven't been seen by outsiders in centuries. This unofficial openness ends abruptly in 1870 when Pope Pius IX, under pressure from conservative Vatican officials who believe Thiner has been too liberal with access, removes him from his position. Thiner dies in 1874, bitter and isolated, but the damage is already done. Word has spread among European historians that the Vatican archives contain materials that could reshape the understanding of medieval papal politics. The investiture controversy, the relationship between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire, and the internal debates that shaped Catholic doctrine. researchers begin formally requesting access, sending letters to the Vatican Secretary of State, citing Theiner's precedent, and arguing that the archives should be open to qualified scholars. Pope Leo XIII, who is more intellectually inclined than his predecessor, faces a dilemma. If he continues the restrictive policy of Pius IX, he risks appearing defensive, as if the Church has something to hide. If he opens the archives completely, he risks exposing documents that could be misinterpreted, taken out of context, or used by anti-Catholic historians to support hostile narratives. The solution he eventually chooses is neither full openness nor complete restriction. Instead, in August of 1881, Leo XIII issues a formal decree, announced quietly through Vatican administrative channels, that establishes new rules for archival access. The decree states that researchers may apply for permission to consult documents, but only materials from papal administrations that ended at least 70 years earlier. This means that in 1881, researchers can access documents up to 1811, but nothing more recent. The 70-year rule becomes the defining feature of Vatican archival policy. For more than a century, it's not arbitrary. The 70-year threshold is chosen because it's assumed that after 70 years, the political sensitivity of most documents has faded, the individuals mentioned in them are likely dead, and the diplomatic consequences of their publication are minimal. But the decree also introduces something else, something that changes the nature of Vatican secrecy forever. It creates a formal classification system, a set of categories that determine which documents can be requested and which remain off-limits, even within the 70-year window. These categories are not made public. They exist in internal Vatican guidelines written in Latin, distributed only to the prefect of the archives and his immediate staff. The categories are based on content, not age. Documents related to the Holy Office, the Vatican's doctrinal enforcement body previously known as the Inquisition, are excluded from the new access rules. Documents related to papal diplomacy with Protestant states are excluded. Documents related to internal Vatican financial administration are excluded. Documents related to the examination of bishops and cardinals for heresy are excluded. What this means in practice is that even if a document is more than 70 years old, it might still be classified as restricted under one of these content-based categories. A researcher applying to see letters exchanged between Pope Clement XI and the Jesuit missions in China during the early 1700s might be granted access, but a researcher asking for records of the Holy Office's investigation into Galileo Galilei in the 1630s would be turned away, not because the documents are too recent, but because they fall under the Holy Office restriction. This dual system, age-based openness combined with content-based restriction, creates a bureaucratic maze that even Vatican officials struggle to navigate. The consequences of this system are immediate. Historians who travel to Rome expecting to conduct research based on the 1881 decree find themselves blocked by rules they didn't know existed. They submit requests for specific documents, wait weeks for a response, and receive rejection letters that provide no explanation beyond a reference to archival regulations. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this opacity is a deliberate strategy to discourage research or simply the result of a poorly designed system, but the effect is the same. The Vatican archives remain functionally closed to most researchers, even after Leo XIII's reform. One of the physical consequences of the 1881 decree is that the Vatican is forced, for the first time, to create a partial catalog. If researchers are going to request documents, there needs to be some way to identify what's available. Between 1881 and 1885, a small team of Vatican archivists begins compiling handwritten inventories of the archive's holdings, organized by papal reign. These inventories are basic. They list the names of popes, the approximate date ranges of their correspondence, and the general subjects covered, but they don't provide document-level descriptions. If you want to know whether the archives contain a letter from Pope Urban VIII to Cardinal Richelieu, in 1635. The inventory will tell you that Urban VIII's correspondence exists, but it won't tell you if that specific letter is present. You would still need to request access, travel to the Vatican, and search through the materials yourself. The inventories themselves are stored in a small office adjacent to the main reading room, the Sala di Studio, which is located on the second floor of the Cortile del Belvedere, a courtyard complex within the Vatican. The Sala di Studio is not designed for large numbers of researchers. It has space for perhaps 8 or 10 people at wooden desks, with limited natural light, no climate control, and shelves lining the walls where frequently requested materials are kept for quicker retrieval. Researchers are not allowed to bring bags into the room. They must leave all personal items in a separate storage area and work only with pencils, never ink, to prevent accidental damage to documents. The physical setup is important because it reinforces the sense that access is a privilege, not a right, something granted at the discretion of Vatican authorities and revocable at any time. You're moving forward now, past the initial shock of Leo XIII's 1881 decree, into the slower, stranger consequences that unfold over the next 2 decades. And what becomes clear is that the rules don't just restrict access, they reshape what can be known about the past. The 70-year threshold creates a moving boundary, a line that advances 1 year for every year that passes, which means that in 1890, researchers can access materials up to 1820, and in 1900, they can access materials up to 1830, but the content-based restrictions remain fixed. This creates historical blind spots that persist for generations. Consider what happens to scholarship on the French Revolution and the Napoleonic period. By the early 1900s, European historians are deeply interested in understanding how the papacy navigated the revolutionary upheaval in France, the seizure of papal territories, the imprisonment of Pope Pius VI by French forces in 1798, and the complex relationship between Pope Pius VII and Napoleon Bonaparte, including the 1801 Concordat that restored some of the Church's authority in France. These events fall within the 70-year access window by 1900, but many of the relevant documents are still restricted because they involve diplomatic correspondence with secular governments, a category excluded under the content-based rules. A French historian named Albert Batandier, working in the early 1900s, petitions the Vatican for access to Pius VII's letters to Napoleon, arguing that these documents are essential for understanding the political history of Europe. His request is denied without explanation. Batandier publishes an essay in 1904 expressing frustration with Vatican archival policy, noting that the 1881 reform promised openness but delivered only selective access. Some historians quietly disagree about whether Batandier's criticism is fair, pointing out that the Vatican did open thousands of documents that were previously unavailable. But Batandier's point stands. The archives are open in theory, but closed in practice for anything that touches on politically sensitive subjects. The physical infrastructure of the archives also begins to strain under the new system. The Torre dei Venti, which was never meant to serve as a permanent storage facility, is now holding materials that researchers are actively requesting, and the process of retrieving these materials is cumbersome. A researcher submits a written request. The request is reviewed by the prefect's office, and if approved, a Vatican employee must physically go to the tower, locate the relevant documents, transport them to the Sala di Studio, and supervise their use. This process can take days or weeks, depending on the volume of requests. To address this, the Vatican begins consolidating frequently requested materials into a new storage area located in the Apostolic Palace's lower level, a series of interconnected rooms that become known as the Archivio Inferiore, the lower archive. The Archivio Inferiore is more accessible than the Torre dei Venti, but it's also more controlled. Documents stored there are cataloged with greater precision, assigned reference codes based on papal reign and subject matter, and tracked in a ledger system that records every time a document is retrieved and returned. This ledger system is the first real attempt at modern archival management within the Vatican, and it introduces a new form of surveillance. If a researcher requests materials related to the 30 Years' War, for example, the ledger records not just what they accessed, but how long they spent with the documents and whether they requested related materials. This information is used internally to identify patterns in researcher behavior, to flag requests that might indicate an anti-Catholic agenda, and to decide whether future requests from the same individual should be approved. The institutional mechanism at work here is subtle but powerful. The Vatican is not simply restricting access to specific documents. It's creating a system that monitors who is interested in which topics, that builds profiles of researchers based on their requests, and that uses this information to shape the narrative that emerges from archival research. A historian who requests materials on papal finances during the Renaissance might find that subsequent requests for related documents are processed more slowly, or that certain materials are suddenly unavailable for conservation reasons. This isn't paranoia. It's documented in internal Vatican correspondence from the period, including a 1905 letter from the prefect of the archives to the Vatican Secretary of State, in which the prefect notes that a particular German historian has been persistently interested in matters that reflect poorly on the Holy See, and recommends that his future requests be subject to additional scrutiny. The real consequence of this system is that it doesn't prevent research, it channels it. Historians learn through experience which topics are accessible and which are not. They adjust their research agendas accordingly, focusing on areas where Vatican cooperation is more likely and avoiding areas where they know they'll face resistance. This creates a distorted historical record, not because information is entirely absent, but because certain kinds of information are systematically harder to obtain, and over time, those gaps become normalized. By 1910, the 70-year rule has advanced enough that researchers can access materials from the 1840s, which includes the early reign of Pope Pius IX, a period of significant upheaval for the papacy. Pius IX's response to the 1848 revolutions, his flight from Rome, his return under French military protection, and his eventual loss of the Papal States in 1870 are all subjects of intense historical interest. But documents related to Pius IX's diplomacy with European powers, his internal debates with cardinals about how to respond to Italian unification, and his financial management of the remaining papal territories are still restricted under content-based rules. A widely accepted historical fact is that Pius IX issued the Syllabus of Errors in 1864, a document condemning modernism, liberalism, and religious pluralism, but the internal Vatican discussions that led to the syllabus, the drafts that were rejected, and the debates among cardinals about its wording remain inaccessible. This matters because it means that historians can study the public positions of the 19th century papacy, but they cannot study the internal disagreements, the political calculations, and the compromises that shaped those positions. One obscure but significant detail from this period involves the Vatican's handling of records related to the Index of Forbidden Books, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, which was maintained by the Congregation of the Index until it was abolished in 1917. The index listed books that Catholics were forbidden to read without special permission, and the congregation's internal records documented the process by which books were examined, debated, and either condemned or approved. These records are explicitly excluded from the 1881 access rules, not because of age, but because the congregation's work is considered an ongoing doctrinal matter. A researcher interested in understanding how the Catholic Church responded to Enlightenment philosophy, or how it evaluated scientific texts, or how it treated works by Catholic authors who challenged traditional teachings, cannot access the records that would answer those questions. The physical structure of the archives continues to evolve during this period. In 1912, under Pope Pius X, the Vatican begins construction of a new archive building, a purpose-built facility designed to house the growing collection and provide better working conditions for researchers. The new building, located near the Porta Sant'Anna entrance to Vatican City, includes climate-controlled storage rooms, a larger reading room with space for 20 researchers, and a dedicated staff area for archivists. The construction takes several years, delayed by World War I, and the building isn't fully operational until the early 1920s. When it opens, it represents a significant shift in how the Vatican thinks about its archives, moving from a model of passive storage to a model of active management. But the new building doesn't change the fundamental rules about access. The 70-year threshold remains in place, and the content-based restrictions remain in place, which means that the improved infrastructure benefits only those researchers who are working on topics that the Vatican considers acceptable. You're crossing into the 1920s now, a decade when the Vatican archives become entangled with a new kind of politics, and the rules about access begin to reflect not just historical sensitivity, but contemporary ideological struggles. Pope Pius XI, who becomes Pope in 1922, is deeply concerned about the rise of secularism, communism, and fascism in Europe, and he views the archives as a potential tool for defending the Church's historical reputation. Under Pius XI, the 70-year rule is maintained, but the process for granting exceptions becomes more formalized. Researchers can now petition for access to materials that fall outside the 70-year window, if they can demonstrate that their work serves the interests of the Church. This is vague by design. What counts as serving the interests of the Church is determined by the prefect of the archives in consultation with the Vatican Secretary of State, and the criteria are never made explicit. In practice, it means that Catholic historians, particularly those working at pontifical universities or institutions with close ties to the Vatican, have an easier time obtaining access than secular historians or historians from Protestant countries. This creates a two-tier system where access is granted based not just on the age and content of documents, but on the perceived reliability and ideological alignment of the researcher. An Italian Catholic historian writing a biography of Pope Leo XIII might be granted access to materials from the 1880s, even though those materials are still within the 70-year window, while a British Protestant historian working on the same subject would be restricted to pre-1851 materials. The institutional mechanism here is patronage, a system where access to knowledge is distributed as a favor rather than as a right, and where the Vatican maintains control over how its history is interpreted by controlling who gets to study it. One verifiable historical anchor from this period is the 1929 Lateran Treaty, the agreement between the Holy See and the Italian government that established Vatican City as an independent sovereign state. The treaty resolves the long-standing dispute over the loss of the Papal States in 1870, but it also creates new complications for the archives. As part of the treaty negotiations, Italy agrees to return certain documents that were seized from papal territories during the unification process, and these documents are reintegrated into the Vatican archives during the early 1930s. The reintegration process reveals just how much material was lost or destroyed during the 19th century, and it forces the Vatican to confront gaps in its own historical record. Some of the returned documents relate to the administration of the Papal States, including tax records, judicial proceedings, and correspondence between papal governors and local officials. These materials are immediately classified as restricted, not because of age, but because they could be used to criticize the Church's temporal governance. A researcher interested in studying how the papacy administered justice in the Papal States during the 1850s, for example, would find that the relevant documents exist but are unavailable. This classification decision is documented in a 1933 internal memo from the prefect's office, which states that materials related to temporal governance should remain restricted to avoid providing ammunition to critics of the Church's historical role. The physical layout of the new archive building, which is now fully operational, reinforces this control. The storage rooms are divided into sections based on sensitivity, with the most restricted materials stored in a secure area accessible only to senior archivists. This secure area, located in the basement of the building, is known informally among Vatican staff as the Archivio Riservato, the reserved archive, though this term is never used in official documents. The reserved archive contains materials that are excluded from the catalog entirely, which means that researchers cannot even request them because they don't know they exist. This includes records of certain papal tribunals, financial documents related to the Vatican Bank's precursor institutions, and correspondence related to concordats with European governments. The existence of the reserved archive is known to a small number of Vatican officials, but it's not acknowledged publicly, and researchers who ask about restricted materials are simply told that they are not available without further explanation. The real consequence of this system becomes visible in the 1930s when historians begin publishing works on the papacy's response to World War I. Pope Benedict XV, who led the Church from 1914 to 1922, attempted to position the Vatican as a neutral mediator during the war, but his efforts were largely unsuccessful, and he was criticized by both sides. Historians want to understand why Benedict's peace initiatives failed, what his private correspondence with European leaders revealed about his strategy, and how the Vatican navigated diplomatic isolation during the war. But the materials that would answer these questions, including Benedict XV's letters to Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, his correspondence with French and British officials, and his internal discussions with cardinals about whether the Vatican should support the League of Nations, are still restricted under content-based rules. A widely accepted historical fact is that Benedict XV issued a peace proposal in 1917 calling for an end to the war without annexations or reparations, but the internal Vatican documents that explain how this proposal was developed, why it was phrased the way it was, and how it was received by Catholic populations in the warring nations remain inaccessible. This creates a situation where the public history of Benedict XV's papacy can be written, but the private history, the history that would reveal his motivations and constraints, cannot. Some historians quietly disagree about whether this restriction is justified, with some arguing that diplomatic correspondence should remain confidential even decades after the events, and others arguing that 70 years is more than enough time for political sensitivities to fade. The 1930s also see the beginning of what becomes a persistent pattern. Researchers from fascist and authoritarian regimes receiving preferential treatment in archival access. Historians affiliated with Mussolini's government in Italy, Franco's government in Spain, and Salazar's government in Portugal are granted access to materials that are denied to researchers from democratic countries. This is not official policy, but it's consistent enough to be noticeable, and it reflects the Vatican's complicated relationship with European fascism during this period. The Vatican is not pro-fascist in any straightforward sense, but it's also deeply opposed to communism, and it views fascist governments as potential allies in defending Catholic interests against secularism and Marxism. This political calculation extends to archival policy, where the Vatican is more willing to share historical materials with governments that present themselves as defenders of Christian civilization, even when those governments are authoritarian. An obscure detail from this period involves the handling of records related to the Vatican's financial dealings during the early 20th century. Pope Pius X, who reigned from 1903 to 1914, undertook significant financial reforms aimed at modernizing the Vatican's administrative structure. But these reforms were controversial within the Curia, the Vatican's governing body, and they generated a large volume of correspondence about budgets, investments, and the management of Peter's pence, the donations collected from Catholics worldwide. These financial records are excluded from researcher access, not just because of content-based restrictions, but because they're actively used by Vatican financial administrators as reference materials. This creates a situation where historical documents are treated as contemporary working files, which means they remain under administrative control rather than being transferred to the archives proper. The consequence is that certain aspects of Vatican financial history are effectively invisible to researchers, not because they've been deliberately hidden, but because they've never been formally archived. You're stepping into the 1940s now, a decade when the Vatican archives become inseparable from one of the most painful questions in modern history, and the rules about access begin to carry moral weight that extends far beyond bureaucratic procedure. Pope Pius XII, who becomes Pope in 1939, leads the Catholic Church through World War II, and his actions during the war, particularly his response to the Holocaust, become the subject of intense scrutiny and debate that continues decades later. The documents that could illuminate Pius XII's decisions, his knowledge of Nazi atrocities, his private communications with German bishops, and his calculations about whether public condemnation would help or harm Jewish populations remain restricted not just by the 70-year rule, but by explicit Vatican decisions to keep them closed for much longer. This isn't speculation. In 1945, immediately after the war ends, the Vatican makes a formal internal decision, documented in correspondence between the prefect of the archives and the Secretary of State, to classify all materials related to Pius XII's wartime diplomacy as indefinitely restricted regardless of age. The rationale given in these internal documents is that releasing materials while participants in the events are still alive could endanger individuals, compromise ongoing Vatican diplomacy, and provide incomplete context that would be misinterpreted. This decision means that even as the 70-year rule advances and materials from the 1870s become accessible, materials from the 1940s remain locked away, creating an enormous gap in what can be studied. The physical manifestation of this restriction is significant. Materials related to Pius XII's papacy are moved to a separate storage area within the archive building, a section that is kept locked and accessible only to the Pope himself and a handful of senior officials. This section is not included in any catalog, and researchers who inquire about World War II-era Vatican documents are told that no decision has been made about when or if they will become available. The institutional mechanism at work here is preemptive damage control. The Vatican is aware that Pius XII's wartime silence regarding Nazi persecution of Jews has already generated criticism, particularly from Jewish organizations and Holocaust survivors, and it's concerned that releasing documents before it can provide comprehensive context will worsen that criticism. But the decision to withhold documents also prevents the Vatican from defending itself effectively, because without access to the archival record, historians cannot verify or refute claims about what Pius XII knew and when he knew it. This creates a deadlock, where the absence of evidence becomes, for critics, evidence of absence, and where the Vatican's refusal to open the archives is interpreted as proof that the documents contain damaging information. One verifiable historical anchor from this period is the 1963 publication of a play called The Deputy by German playwright Rolf Hochhuth, which portrays Pius XII as morally culpable for failing to speak out against the Holocaust. The play triggers enormous controversy, with Catholic institutions defending Pius XII and Jewish organizations demanding greater transparency about Vatican actions during the war. Pope Paul VI, who becomes Pope in 1963, responds to the controversy by authorizing a limited publication project. Between 1965 and 1981, the Vatican publishes 12 volumes of selected documents from Pius XII's wartime papacy, titled Acts and Documents of the Holy See Relative to the Second World War. These volumes contain letters, diplomatic cables, and internal Vatican memos, but they're carefully curated by Jesuit historians working under Vatican supervision, and critics point out that the selection process is opaque. The Vatican chooses which documents to publish and which to exclude, and there's no way for independent researchers to verify whether the published materials represent the full picture or just the materials that cast the Vatican in the best light. This partial release creates a new problem. Instead of satisfying calls for transparency, it intensifies them, because historians can now see that relevant documents exist, but they still cannot access the complete archive to assess the context and representativeness of the published selections. The real consequence of this situation is that it poisons the well for decades. Vatican archival policy, which was already restrictive, becomes associated in the public mind with cover-up and defensiveness. Jewish scholars and Holocaust historians begin to view the Vatican archives as fundamentally unreliable, a repository that cannot be trusted because access is politicized and selective. This perception damages the Vatican's credibility, even in areas unrelated to World War II. Because if the Church is willing to withhold documents about the Holocaust, what else is it withholding? The physical space of the archives during this period reflects this tension. The reading room, which by the 1960s has been expanded to accommodate more researchers, becomes a site of quiet frustration. Historians working on medieval church councils or Renaissance papal diplomacy have access to materials that are now more than 4 centuries old, but they work alongside colleagues who are being turned away from studying 20th century events. The disparity is visible and uncomfortable, and it creates an atmosphere where even successful archival research feels incomplete, shadowed by the awareness of what remains closed. An obscure but telling detail from this period involves the Vatican's handling of records related to its financial relationship with fascist Italy. During the 1930s, the Vatican invested a significant portion of the financial settlement from the Lateran Treaty into Italian government bonds and corporate stocks, including companies that profited from Italy's invasion of Ethiopia and its alliance with Nazi Germany. These financial records are excluded from researcher access, not because they relate to doctrine or diplomacy, but because they could raise uncomfortable questions about whether the Vatican indirectly benefited from fascist aggression. A Vatican financial administrator named Bernardino Nogara managed these investments, and his files, which would document how the Vatican's portfolio was structured, where funds were directed, and what knowledge Vatican officials had about the activities of the companies they invested in, remain in the reserved archive, inaccessible even to Vatican-approved historians. Some historians quietly disagree about whether these financial records are properly considered archival materials, or whether they're administrative documents that fall outside the scope of the Vatican secret archives, but the effect is the same. The financial history of the 20th century Vatican remains obscured, not by explicit censorship, but by bureaucratic categorization that keeps certain materials in a different institutional space. The broader consequence of the Vatican's archival policy during the 1940s through the 1960s is that it creates a generation of historians who approach Vatican sources with suspicion. Graduate students entering the field during this period learn, as part of their professional training, that Vatican archives are useful for certain kinds of research, but fundamentally compromised for others. This shapes not just individual research projects, but entire historiographical approaches. Topics that require Vatican documentation are studied less because the barriers to access are so high, and topics that can be studied using non-Vatican sources are studied more. This creates an imbalanced historical literature where some periods and subjects are exhaustively documented and others remain underexplored not because they're less important, but because the sources are harder to access. You're moving into the 1970s and 1980s now, a period when the Vatican begins to recognize that its archival policies are becoming unsustainable, and the institution starts making incremental changes that suggest a shift in thinking, though the fundamental restrictions remain in place. Pope Paul VI, who leads the Church through most of the 1970s, is more open to dialogue with secular scholars than his predecessors, and under his leadership, the 70-year rule is maintained, but the process for requesting exceptions becomes slightly more transparent. In 1974, the Vatican publishes a brief guide to the secret archives, the first such publication in the institution's history, which outlines the general structure of the collection, explains the 70-year rule, and provides basic information about how to submit research applications. The guide is only 30 pages long, written in Italian with no translations, and it's distributed primarily to Catholic universities, but it represents a symbolic step toward greater openness. The guide includes a map of the archive building, showing the locations of the reading room, the catalog office, and the main storage areas, though it does not mention the reserved archive or any restricted sections. One verifiable historical anchor from this period is the 1978 election of Pope John Paul II. who becomes the first non-Italian pope in more than 4 centuries. John Paul II is a historian by training, having completed doctoral work on phenomenology and ethics, and he has a personal appreciation for the importance of archival research. Under his leadership, which lasts until 2005, the Vatican archives undergo a series of reforms that make them more accessible to researchers while still preserving core restrictions. In 1981, exactly 100 years after Leo XIII's initial decree, John Paul II authorizes the opening of materials from the pontificate of Pope Leo XIII himself, which means that documents from 1878 to 1903 become accessible. This is significant because Leo XIII's papacy coincided with major social and political transformations in Europe, including the rise of socialism, the development of Catholic social teaching, and the Vatican's response to modern scientific and philosophical challenges. Historians immediately begin requesting access to Leo XIII's correspondence with European heads of state, his encyclicals on labor and social justice, and his internal discussions with cardinals about how to engage with modernity. The opening of Leo XIII's papers requires a massive cataloging effort. Between 1981 and 1985, a team of Vatican archivists creates detailed inventories of the materials, assigning reference codes to individual documents and creating subject indexes that allow researchers to locate specific topics. This is the most comprehensive cataloging project in the archive's history up to that point, and it establishes protocols that are still used today. Each document is assigned a code that includes the papal reign, the year, the type of document, and a sequential number, such as LEO 1885 CORR 142, which would refer to the 142nd item of correspondence from 1885. The cataloging system is not perfect. It's designed primarily for administrative convenience rather than researcher usability, and the subject indexes are inconsistent, relying on categories that made sense to Vatican archivists in the 1980s, but don't always align with how modern historians conceptualize research questions. But it's a substantial improvement over the earlier system where researchers had to request entire collections and sift through them manually. The physical infrastructure of the archives also improves during this period. In 1980, the Vatican installs climate control systems in the main storage areas, addressing long-standing problems with humidity and temperature fluctuations that were damaging documents. The storage rooms are equipped with specialized shelving designed to support the weight of bound volumes without sagging, and the lighting is upgraded to reduce the risk of fire. The reading room is renovated to include better lighting and more desk space, and researchers are provided with foam supports and cotton gloves to use when handling fragile materials. These changes reflect a growing recognition that the archives are not just a private Vatican resource, but a scholarly infrastructure that serves a broader community of researchers. The institutional mechanism that drives these reforms is partly generational. By the 1980s, many of the Vatican officials who had worked in the archives during the 1940s and 1950s have retired or died, and they're replaced by a younger generation of archivists who are more comfortable with the idea of scholarly access. Some of these younger archivists have studied at secular universities, hold advanced degrees in history or library science, and view their role as facilitating research rather than gatekeeping. This doesn't mean that restrictions disappear, but it does mean that the culture within the archives becomes less defensive and more service-oriented. A researcher who is denied access to a particular document is now more likely to receive an explanation, even if it's just a reference to the content-based restrictions rather than a flat rejection with no reason given. One obscure detail from this period involves the Vatican's handling of materials related to Pope Pius IX's syllabus of errors. Although the syllabus itself was published in 1864 and its text is widely available, the internal Vatican discussions that led to its creation, including draft versions and correspondence among cardinals about its wording, have remained restricted under the content-based rules. In 1985, a German historian named Hubert Wolff petitions for access to these materials, arguing that they're essential for understanding how the 19th century papacy conceptualized its relationship with modernity. Wolff's request is initially denied, but he appeals the decision, citing the 1974 guide which states that restrictions should be applied based on objective criteria rather than administrative discretion. His appeal is reviewed by a panel of Vatican officials, and after several months, he's granted limited access to some of the draft materials, though not to the full correspondence. This is the first documented case of a researcher successfully appealing a denial, and it sets a precedent that other historians begin to follow. The appeals process is formalized in 1987 with the creation of an internal review committee that considers requests for exceptions to the standard rules. The committee includes the prefect of the archives, the Vatican Secretary of State's representative, and 2 external consultants, typically Catholic historians with ties to pontifical universities. The committee meets quarterly to review appeals, and its decisions are final. The creation of the committee is a significant institutional development because it introduces a degree of procedural transparency that didn't previously exist, but it also entrenches the Vatican's control over access by codifying the exceptions process rather than eliminating restrictions. The real consequence of these 1980s reforms is that they create a window of optimism among researchers. For the first time in the archive's history, there's a sense that the Vatican is moving, albeit slowly, toward greater openness. Historians begin planning long-term research projects based on the assumption that materials from the early 20th century will eventually become accessible. Doctoral students choose dissertation topics that require Vatican sources, betting that by the time they're ready to conduct archival research, the materials will be available. This optimism is partly justified. Between 1985 and 2000, the Vatican continues to open materials on a rolling basis, advancing the access threshold from 1903 to 1922, which includes the papacies of Pope Pius X and Pope Benedict XV. But the optimism is also premature, because the really sensitive materials, the documents from Pius XII's papacy and the World War II period, remain closed, and there's no indication of when they might be opened. The consequence is that by the 1990s, 2 parallel historiographies emerge. There's a rich and detailed literature on the 19th century papacy based on extensive archival research, and there's a much thinner, more speculative literature on the 20th century papacy, based on published sources, memoirs, and the selective document releases from the 1960s and 1970s. The gap between these 2 literatures is a direct result of archival policy, and it shapes how the Catholic Church's modern history is understood. Some historians quietly disagree about whether the 20th century gap is really that problematic, pointing out that archival access is never complete and that historians are trained to work with incomplete sources, but the gap is noticeable enough that it becomes a recurring topic at academic conferences and in scholarly journals dedicated to church history. You're arriving at the beginning of the 21st century now, a moment when the Vatican's archival restrictions collide with a transformed global context, and the pressure for transparency reaches levels that the institution can no longer ignore. The world has changed dramatically since 1881, when Leo XIII established the 70-year rule. The Internet has made information vastly more accessible. Digital archives have become standard practice in major libraries and museums. And the Holocaust has been extensively documented through survivor testimony, war crimes trials, and the opening of Soviet and Eastern European archives after the Cold War. In this context, the Vatican's continued restriction of Pius XII's papers looks increasingly anachronistic, and Jewish organizations, Holocaust scholars, and even some Catholic historians begin mounting coordinated campaigns for the archives to be opened. In 2002, a group of Catholic and Jewish scholars, known as the Catholic Jewish Historical Commission, issues a report stating that the published selections of Pius XII's documents are insufficient for reaching definitive conclusions about his wartime actions, and they call for the full archives to be opened to independent researchers. The report is careful in its wording, avoiding direct accusations, but its implications are clear. Without access to the complete archival record, the debate about Pius XII's legacy cannot be resolved, and the Vatican's credibility on historical matters is compromised. Pope John Paul II, who is by now elderly and in declining health, does not respond to the Commission's call before his death in 2005. His successor, Pope Benedict XVI, inherits the archival question along with a church facing multiple crises, including the clergy sexual abuse scandal, declining attendance in Europe, and challenges to its moral authority. Benedict XVI is himself a scholar, a theologian who has written extensively on church history, and he understands the importance of archival access, but he also recognizes the political risks of opening Pius XII's papers. In 2006, Benedict commissions an internal Vatican review to assess what opening the World War II archives would entail, how long it would take to catalog the materials, and what resources would be required. The review, completed in 2007, concludes that the materials related to Pius XII's papacy are not yet fully catalogued, that many documents are stored in different sections of the archive without unified reference codes, and that preparing them for researcher access would require a multi-year project involving dozens of archivists. This becomes the Vatican's official explanation for why the archives remain closed, shifting the justification from political sensitivity to technical capacity. The explanation is partly true, but also partly strategic. While it's accurate that the cataloging is incomplete, it's also true that the Vatican could have prioritized this work decades earlier if it had chosen to do so. The delay is not just about technical challenges, but about institutional reluctance to confront a difficult historical question. One verifiable historical anchor from this period is the 2012 publication of documents related to Pope Pius XI's relationship with fascist Italy, which are opened as part of the normal progression of the 70-year rule. These documents include correspondence between Pius XI and Benito Mussolini's government, internal Vatican assessments of fascism, and drafts of an encyclical condemning racism and anti-Semitism that Pius XI commissioned in 1938 but never published before his death in 1939. The discovery of this draft encyclical, known by its opening words, Humani Generis Unitas, or the unity of the human race, generates significant scholarly attention because it suggests that Pius XI was prepared to take a stronger public stance against Nazi racial ideology than he ultimately did. The documents raise questions about why the encyclical was never issued, whether it was suppressed by Vatican officials who disagreed with its contents, and how its message might have influenced Catholic responses to the Holocaust if it had been published. These questions can only be partially answered because the full context requires access to materials from Pius XII's early papacy, which remain restricted. The physical infrastructure of the archives continues to evolve during this period. In 2007, the Vatican begins a digitization project, using high-resolution scanners to create digital copies of the most fragile documents. The project starts with materials from the medieval period, including papal bulls and diplomatic correspondence from the 1300s and 1400s, which are at risk of deterioration. The digitization is slow and expensive, requiring specialized equipment and trained technicians, but it represents a significant investment in preserving the archives for future generations. Digital copies are stored on secure servers within Vatican City, and there's discussion about eventually making some of these digital materials available online. Though no concrete plans are announced, the idea of online access is controversial within the Vatican, with some officials arguing that it would democratize access to church history, and others warning that it would eliminate the Vatican's ability to monitor who is using the materials and for what purposes. The institutional mechanism at work here is a tension between preservation and control, between the Vatican's recognition that it has a responsibility to safeguard historical documents and its desire to maintain oversight of how those documents are used. An obscure but significant detail from this period involves the Vatican's handling of materials related to the clerical sexual abuse scandal. As allegations of abuse become public starting in the 1990s, and as lawsuits and investigations reveal patterns of institutional cover-up, Questions arise about what the Vatican knew and when. Personnel files, correspondence between bishops and the Vatican about problematic priests, and internal documents related to the canonical processes for addressing abuse. Allegations become subjects of legal discovery in civil and criminal cases. The Vatican's position is that these materials are not part of the secret archives, but are instead held by dioceses and by Vatican congregations, such as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which handles doctrinal and disciplinary matters. This jurisdictional distinction allows the Vatican to argue that the materials are not subject to the archive's access rules and that they're protected by religious confidentiality. But the distinction also raises questions about how the Vatican defines what belongs in the archives and what doesn't, and whether materials are being kept out of the archives specifically to avoid making them accessible to researchers and legal investigators. Some historians quietly disagree about whether abuse-related documents should be considered archival materials, with some arguing that they're administrative records that are properly held by the relevant church authorities, and others arguing that anything related to church governance should eventually be transferred to the archives and made available for historical study. The real consequence of the Vatican's approach during the early 2000s is that it deepens skepticism about institutional transparency. The Catholic Church's reputation is damaged not just by the abuse scandal itself, but by the perception that the Church is more interested in protecting itself than in revealing the truth. This perception extends to the archives, where the continued restriction of 20th century materials feeds a narrative that the Vatican has something to hide. Journalists begin writing articles about Vatican secrecy that link the closed archives to the abuse crisis, even though the two issues are technically separate. The association sticks in the public mind, and it creates a context where any Vatican claim about the reasons for archival restrictions is met with suspicion. By 2010, Pope Benedict XVI recognizes that the archival question is damaging the Church's credibility, and he begins to consider whether opening Pius XII's papers might actually help the Church by demonstrating transparency. But he also recognizes that opening the archives without adequate preparation could backfire if the materials are misconstrued or if they reveal decisions that are difficult to defend in hindsight. The dilemma is genuine. The Vatican is caught between competing pressures, wanting to appear open while fearing the consequences of openness, wanting to defend Pius XII's legacy while knowing that the archival record is complex and ambiguous. Benedict does not resolve the dilemma during his papacy, which ends with his resignation in 2013, leaving the question for his successor. You're reaching the moment that changes everything, the decision that reshapes how the Vatican archives operate and what they represent. And it happens in March 2019 when Pope Francis announces that the materials from Pope Pius XII's papacy will be open to researchers on March 2, 2020. Nearly 75 years after Pius XII's death and decades earlier than the 70-year rule would require. The announcement is made during a meeting with a group of scholars at the Vatican, and Francis frames it as an act of transparency, stating that the Church is not afraid of history and that opening the archives will allow for a fuller understanding of a complex period. The decision is surprising for several reasons. First, it breaks with the 70-year tradition that has governed archival policy since 1881. Second, it comes despite the fact that the cataloging work is still incomplete, with Vatican archivists estimating that only about 70% of the Pius XII materials have been fully processed. Third, it happens during a papacy that has been marked by Francis's willingness to challenge Vatican conventions and to prioritize transparency over institutional protectionism. The decision is not universally welcomed within the Vatican. Some officials, particularly those in the Secretariat of State, express concern that opening the archives without a comprehensive communication strategy will expose the Church to misinterpretation and criticism. But Francis overrides these objections, and the opening proceeds, as announced. The date, March 2, 2020, is chosen because it marks the anniversary of Pius XII's election to the papacy in 1939. The date becomes infamous for a different reason, because it falls just days before the COVID-19 pandemic shuts down international travel and forces the closure of the Vatican archives, along with nearly every other research institution in the world. Researchers who have been waiting for decades to access Pius XII's papers arrive in Rome in early March 2020, only to be told that the archives are closing indefinitely due to public health concerns. The irony is painful. After nearly 80 years of waiting, the archives open for less than 2 weeks before becoming inaccessible again. They remain closed for more than a year, not reopening fully until May 2021, when researchers finally gain sustained access to the materials. What they find is both illuminating and complicated. The documents reveal that Pius XII was extensively informed about Nazi atrocities, that he received detailed reports from bishops and nuncios, papal ambassadors, about the persecution of Jews, and that he engaged in behind-the-scenes diplomatic efforts to assist Jewish refugees. But the documents also reveal his calculations about public silence. His fear that open condemnation would provoke Nazi retaliation against Catholics and possibly worsen the situation for Jews, and his prioritization of church institutions over public moral witness. The archival record does not provide a simple verdict. It shows a pope who was neither a Nazi sympathizer nor a heroic resistor, but rather a cautious diplomat, navigating an impossible situation with imperfect information and competing priorities. One of the physical elements that researchers immediately focus on is the filing system used in Pius XII's Secretariat of State, which organized incoming reports by country and subject rather than by date. This means that to understand the Vatican's response to events in Poland, for example, a researcher has to examine multiple files that are stored in different locations, cross-referencing diplomatic cables, bishops' reports, and internal memos. The system was designed for administrative efficiency, allowing Secretariat staff to quickly locate information about a specific country, but it makes it difficult for researchers to reconstruct chronological narratives. This is not an accident. The filing system reflects how the Vatican understood its role during the war, as a diplomatic entity managing relationships with multiple governments rather than as a moral authority taking unified positions on global events. The institutional mechanism revealed by the opened archives is what some historians begin calling reactive diplomacy, a pattern where the Vatican responded to specific requests and situations but avoided taking proactive public stances that might compromise its diplomatic position. An obscure but revealing detail from the open materials involves the Vatican's use of encrypted telegrams during the war. The Vatican had its own cipher system, developed in the 1930s, that allowed it to communicate securely with nuncios in occupied territories. Some of these encrypted messages were decrypted and intercepted by Allied intelligence services, and copies of the decrypted messages are now in British and American archives. But the Vatican's own copies, including the encryption keys and the plain text versions of incoming messages, were not previously available to researchers. The opened archives include these materials, and they reveal the extent to which the Vatican was aware of specific atrocities, including massacres of Jewish communities, deportations to concentration camps, and the complicity of some Catholic clergy in fascist and Nazi regimes. The telegrams also show that Pius XII authorized discreet assistance to Jews, including providing false baptismal certificates and hiding Jewish families in Vatican properties, but that he insisted this assistance remain secret to avoid jeopardizing Vatican neutrality. The real consequence of the 2020 opening is that it doesn't settle the debate about Pius XII's legacy, it transforms the debate. Instead of arguing about whether the Vatican is hiding evidence, historians are now arguing about how to interpret the evidence that has been revealed. Some historians conclude that Pius XII did as much as was possible given the constraints he faced, and that public condemnation would have been futile or counterproductive. Other historians argue that moral leadership requires public witness even when it's costly, and that Pius XII's silence, regardless of his private actions, constituted a failure of papal responsibility. These are substantive disagreements about ethics and history, not disputes about access to sources. The opening also reveals how much the Vatican's earlier archival restrictions shaped historical understanding. For decades, the absence of primary sources created space for speculation, accusation, and defensive apologetics. Now that the sources are available, the conversation becomes more grounded, but it's also more complex because the documents don't support simple narratives on either side. This is what archival transparency actually looks like. Not vindication or condemnation, but complication, nuance, and the recognition that historical actors face difficult choices with imperfect information. The physical changes to the archives following the 2020 opening are significant. The reserved archive, which had existed informally since the 1930s, is officially dismantled, with materials being reintegrated into the general collection and assigned proper catalog codes. The process takes several years and involves reclassifying thousands of documents. Some materials that were in the reserved archive turn out to be less sensitive than originally thought, routine diplomatic correspondence that was restricted out of an abundance of caution. Other materials are genuinely sensitive, including records of Vatican financial transactions with fascist governments and correspondence about the Vatican's response to communist regimes in Eastern Europe. These materials are now accessible, and they're generating new research on topics that were previously impossible to study. The institutional mechanism that the 2020 opening represents is a shift from control to confidence, a recognition that the Vatican's credibility is better served by transparency than by restriction. This doesn't mean that all Vatican materials are now available. The 70-year rule still applies to more recent papacies, which means that materials from the 1950s onward remain restricted. And content-based restrictions still exist for materials related to living individuals, ongoing diplomatic relationships, and certain sacramental records. But the principle has changed. The default assumption is now that materials should be accessible unless there's a specific, articulable reason to restrict them, rather than the reverse. Some historians quietly disagree about whether the 2020 opening represents a genuine transformation or merely a symbolic gesture, pointing out that the Vatican still controls access through the application process, the reading room rules, and the ban on photography or digital copying of most materials. But even skeptical historians acknowledge that the opening is significant, that it provides access to materials that were previously unavailable, and that it sets a precedent for future openings. The broader consequence of the 2020 decision is that it forces the Vatican to confront the idea that its archives are not just an internal resource, but a public trust. The documents in the secret archives document not just the institutional history of the Catholic Church, but also major events in European and global history, including wars, treaties, social movements, and cultural transformations. The Vatican is a custodian of this history, and with that custodianship comes responsibility. By opening the Pius XII archives, the Vatican acknowledges this responsibility, however reluctantly, and it creates expectations for future openings. Researchers are already planning for the eventual opening of materials from Pope John XXIII and Pope Paul VI, whose papacies encompass the Second Vatican Council and the social upheavals of the 1960s. These materials won't be accessible under the 70-year rule until the 2030s and 2040s, but the 2020 precedent suggests that the Vatican might choose to open them earlier, and historians are preparing their research agendas accordingly. The night the Vatican archives changed their rules forever wasn't actually in 2020, and it wasn't in 1881 when Leo XIII first established the 70-year threshold. It happened gradually, across decades and through incremental decisions, each one reshaping what could be known and who could know it. But if you had to choose a single moment, March 2019, when Francis announced the opening of Pius XII's papers, is when the old model finally broke. The Vatican's archives are still restricted, still controlled, still shaped by institutional priorities, but they're no longer governed by the assumption that secrecy is the default and transparency is the exception. That assumption, which had defined Vatican archival policy for more than a century, is gone, and what replaces it is still being worked out in reading rooms and catalog offices and digitization labs across Vatican City, one document at a time, one research request at a time, one historical argument at a time, and that's where we'll leave it tonight. If you found this story valuable, if it changed how you think about Vatican secrecy or about how institutions manage their own histories, consider pressing the like button. It helps others find these stories. And if you're not subscribed yet, go ahead and do that now. We share a new story every day, always aiming for the same thing: real information, real history, spoken calmly and clearly in the middle of the night. Thanks for listening. Sleep well.